I am very skeptical that with the way things are going for Russia in Ukraine, that Russia can really get there unless they succeed in defeating Ukraine, or there's a ceasefire and they're able to regroup, they're able to keep that level of defense expenditure, and NATO doesn't.
Welcome to Times Radio Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today, on the first day of the NATO summit, we are very privileged to have Ambassador Kurt Volker talking to us. Now, Ambassador Volker, former senior US diplomat with deep experience and relationship at the top level of US, European, and Eurasian diplomatic policy. You were the US ambassador to NATO for a while and US special representative to Ukraine. So, the topics we're covering today are perfect. And you're an executive director of the ASU McCain Institute, and you've had senior roles in the State Department, National Security Council, and several for-profit and not-for-profit boards, I understand. Ambassador Kurt, welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks so much, Philip. Thanks so much. Yes, I founded the McCain Institute with the McCain family in 2012 and was there until 2019. I would add, I'm now also a distinguished fellow with the Center for European Policy Analysis, and I do my own advisory and consulting work through Alliance Strategic Advisors.
Well, that makes you even better for what we want to talk about today. But the first thing is, until today, and across Europe, whenever Ukraine has started to come up in some of the questions around the NATO conference, it's been weeks or months before most European leaders and even POTUS has mentioned Ukraine or Zelensky. Yet, in the last 7 days, about 1,500 Russian drones and over 70 missiles have hit civilian targets across Ukraine's major cities. Is Ukraine now the forgotten war?
I wouldn't say it's forgotten. And of course, at the NATO meeting today, President Zelensky will be there. He'll be at the dinner. He's having several side meetings with European leaders. And it goes on and on. What we see now is that attention has been diverted towards Israel and Iran because of the immediacy of that war and the U.S. airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. So that is grabbing all the headlines at the moment. And I think the other dynamic that has played here is that President Trump really wanted to push for a ceasefire to get Russia to stop its attacks on Ukraine. Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire, but Russia never did. And that would getting Russia there is going to require pressure on Russia. Now, we just put a lot of pressure on Iran, and Iran is now saying, okay, they'll do a ceasefire. I'm not suggesting that the U.S. ought to launch airstrikes against Russia, but we need to see a lot more pressure on Putin to get him to want to actually have a ceasefire.
Well, Putin criticized Donald Trump over Iran and tried to sway him to change his mind and not go and attack Iran's nuclear facilities. What do you think Putin is thinking, after the attack? And, of course, the Iranian foreign minister then went straight to Moscow to sit and have discussions with Putin because they had this strategic agreement. But what do you think Putin is now thinking when he's trying to play his relationship with Iran in one hand, but trying to maintain some form of relationship with Donald Trump on the other?
Yeah, well, first off, I think Putin feels that because he already has a massive nuclear arsenal, he's in a different situation as compared to Iran. So he's not worried about anyone attacking Russia in reality. He claims he is because that's how he justifies Russia's aggression, but he isn't really afraid of anyone attacking Russia. That's the number one thing. Second, I think he feels quite confident that Trump wants to end the war and do business deals with Russia. So he doesn't want, that is to say, Putin doesn't feel that he's going to get he's not going to get the Iran treatment. Let's put it that way. So he's not worried about that. Now, as far as showing sympathy to Iran, Putin has always liked doing that. He wants to position himself as the opposite of the United States. And of course, he benefits from Iran's drone technology in his attacks on Ukraine, and he wants to continue that. But when he says to the Iranian leader, we'll provide you maximum support, those are just empty words because he has no support to give.
But the other thing around support is we've seen Vladimir Putin lose his foothold in the Middle East whenever Syria and Assad's government collapsed. At least his relationship with Iran gave him a toehold in the region. Do you think he's concerned that he is losing total influence, with what's happening in Iran, especially when there was an element of discussion around the potential for regime change, even though that was never an aim of what the United States was doing in bombing Iran's nuclear facilities?
So let's take a moment and talk about regime change, because you're absolutely right that Iran does provide a toehold, is a good phrase, for Russia in the Middle East. Uh, and no one is, well, I shouldn't say no one. The Iranian people would love to have regime change, but they are heavily repressed, and the security forces are ruthless in Iran, as we all know, with everything from repressing women in the way they dress to arresting any kind of protesters, tortures, public executions, you name it. So it is very hard to bring about a regime change for the Iranian people, although they would love that. The United States, under President Trump, has been very clear that it will not take part in trying to force a regime change in Iran. They do not want to see the U.S. involved militarily. Israel, on the other hand, I think would like to facilitate the Iranian people executing a regime change. They see an Iranian regime that since 1979 has called for the destruction of Israel. And having now launched direct military attacks against Israel, they would probably against Iran, they would probably like to see that go all the way. So those are the different nuances there. But I think the Iranian regime has come forward and agreed to a ceasefire precisely because they want to avoid getting to the point of a regime change. So they'd rather stay in power and buy time for future nuclear weapons than to actually lose power.
But it's interesting. After the US attack, we all knew Iran was going to have to respond. And we've had probably, whenever we see ballistic missiles being fired at a US military base or two US military bases, the most polite firing of ballistic missiles you can ever get. But then that leads to wars of words between Israel and Iran. And then Donald Trump's war of words this morning turned around and says, effectively, quoting him, they don't know what the F they are doing. Do you think POTUS's declared ceasefire is actually going to last?
I actually do. I do. I think the Iranians have a strong incentive to have a ceasefire, so they avoid regime change. I think the U.S. under President Trump is going to push very hard for this. And I think he has already spoken with Netanyahu and made it clear that this is a priority now for the United States. Israel has done what it had to do, substantially weakened Iran. The U.S. did what it had to do, substantially weaken Iran's nuclear program. So now is the time, and I think he's going to push for that, and I think it'll actually work.
So has Donald Trump actually, in reality, pulled off a masterstroke here by using these massive ordnance penetrating bombs?
Yeah, well, that's the question. We don't know the battle damage in any specificity. What exactly was destroyed? What remains? Was all of the enriched uranium there and now that is unusable? Or was it already moved out, being stored somewhere, and Iran will try to reconstitute a nuclear program in some new secret facility? We don't know the answers to those questions at this point.
Well, I think you've just highlighted the priority information requirements that all of the intelligence agencies around the West and the Israelis will be working on, first and foremost. But it's a good one. But getting back to the NATO summit today, it's quite an important one, given that we've got two major conflicts around the world and we've got instability brewing down in Southeast Asia. What are you expecting to come out of the NATO conference today?
I think today we're going to have a lot of today and tomorrow, I should say, dinner tonight and a meeting tomorrow. There's going to be discussion about Iran, Israel, the Middle East, how to stabilize all of this. That's what people want to talk about. That's on everybody's mind. For NATO itself, the number one issue is setting the target for defense spending as a portion of GDP at 5%. That is incredibly important to President Trump. And it's important for the European allies to do so in order to make sure we retain American support and engagement in NATO. So it's got to be a two-way street, and setting that target there makes it more of a two-way street. So I think that is the big issue. The elephant in the room that is not going to get a lot of attention is Russia's war against Ukraine. Uh, President Zelensky will be there at the dinner. He will not be attending the NATO meeting itself. That's just NATO allies. And as far as discussions about Ukraine, NATO's role in Ukraine, Ukrainian membership, I think there'll be talk among the European allies and with Ukraine on the margins. But we're not going to have a big public show of this at NATO in The Hague because the U.S. is now in a very different place. We're just calling for a ceasefire in place. President Trump has tried to draw equivalence between Russia and Ukraine, saying it's like two kids on a playground. That's very different from the European perspective of Russia as a ruthless aggressor against an independent democracy next door, and that democracy having a right and need to defend itself. So rather than put that difference of approach or difference of perspective on display, I think Ukraine is just going to be pushed down the agenda as a main topic and focus instead on just the capability issues.
But Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, in his opening remarks, has turned around and said that that Russia is the number one enemy and should be focused on. But it's interesting you talk about the push to 5% of GDP because the United States is spending 3.17% of its GDP on defense at the moment. And that defense is split North Atlantic and Pacific. So, because of the size of the United States, it's focused in two different directions. So there's probably 1.5%, if I'm being generous, that's focused in the North Atlantic area. Is Donald Trump going to sign up to 5%, or is he going to say, no, we're spending enough anyway?
Well, it's interesting because just the other day, he said publicly that, the NATO allies need to do this, but the U.S. doesn't need to. We don't need to agree to that. Probably no one had briefed him to that point that the 5% being agreed at NATO is designed to be 3.5% of hardcore defense spending through military budgets and 1.5% on supportive expenditures like infrastructure, roads, cyber defense, etc. The United States is already doing that. So for President Trump to say we're not going to, I don't think people had actually briefed him that actually, Mr. President, we are. It's the Europeans that aren't.
But again, the talk of this 5% and the European countries and the UK, as I include as part of that, it's great. They're all patting each other on the back and saying we're going to do this and not working out how they're going to spend it. But they're saying by 2035. Does that not give Vladimir Putin a green light to do something before 2035, whenever the big expenditure comes in? And of course, we had President Zelensky in the sidelines of the meetings turn around and make a statement to say that he expected Russia to test NATO's Article 5 within the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think that Vladimir Putin would like to be able to attack NATO. And maybe within 5 years. Certainly, he's trying to increase the size of his military. He's reoriented his economy to military production. He would like to be in that position. Whether he would pull the trigger or not is a different question, but he'd like to be in that position. And I am very skeptical that with the way things are going for Russia in Ukraine, that Russia can really get there unless they succeed in defeating Ukraine, or there's a ceasefire and they're able to regroup, they're able to keep that level of defense expenditure, and NATO doesn't. So that I think is the lay of the land. Now, in terms of timelines, 2035 is meant to be the end point. That's when everybody gets to 5%. It doesn't mean that you don't do anything until then. It means you're ramping up. And that's rational because spending that much money quickly would involve wasting a lot of money. So you've got to build up the programs, you've got to have the equipment to buy, you've got to fit it into forces and a defense plan that is going to be sensible and a good use of money. So I think that timeline is serious in the sense of NATO actually producing a capability out of this. And I think Vladimir Putin will get that too, that this is not a delay or a green light for the next 10 years. It is actually the beginning of a process that will strengthen NATO over that entire time.
But again, NATO's recognition, and a lot of the countries are recognizing that they're not in a good place. The UK has just finished its strategic defence review, in that it had talked of 2.6% and eventually sometime getting to 3%. And then Keir Starmer is expected to stand up today and go, no, we have got a plan to go to 5%. Well, the original plan was only published a couple of weeks ago, and therefore its foundation has just been ripped up and chucked away. We're seeing Spain turning around and saying that they're not going to stand up and spend 5%. Are we seeing fractures now in NATO? And will Putin start to exploit those fractures?
This is not new. We've always had differences within NATO, and especially differences over willingness to spend on defense. I think the priority for European allies at the moment should be to emphasize unity, and should be to say, yes, we need to build more capabilities and we will do so. That's the message that needs to come out. So I was very disappointed to see the Spanish president say this in the way he did. And I expect that they will be getting a lot of pressure now from everybody, not just the United States, from everybody. Don't mess it up. We need the summit to be a success. And then in reality, there will be differences in implementation going forward, just as there were on the 2% target after that was agreed at the Wales summit in 2014. There were massive differences in allied defense expenditure. That will continue, but it is setting the right target at least. And I think that is the number one thing.
But do you think Article 5 within NATO is still sacrosanct? And because there was a ill-informed debate around Article 5 if US assets had got attacked by Iran in the Middle East, because people forgot that or hadn't realized that there's a geographical element to this, and it doesn't include those sorts of overseas bases. But it's opened the debate again, and there are other discussions going on around whether countries can rely on, in particular, the United States coming to their aid should an Article 5 scenario raise its head. Is it as secure as it's always been, or as people have always thought it should be?
That's a great question, because in the sense that people usually mean a large-scale conventional attack against a NATO ally, probably by Russia, in order to defeat that country and take it over, yes, Article 5 will kick in, no question in my mind at all. Every NATO ally will rush to support the ally that's attacked, and the US will do so too. So I'm not worried about that. What I am worried about, however, is that that is not the scenario that's most likely. The scenario that's most likely is nuance, a hybrid attack or a localized land grab. And those things are already happening. So we see Russia launching cyber attacks against NATO countries every day. We see them engaging in other hybrid activities, such as disinformation, targeted assassinations, such as we've seen in the UK. We've seen arson. We've seen paid for protests. We've seen the deliberate use of bribery and corruption to influence politicians, political parties inside our own NATO countries. So we see a lot of hybrid efforts by Russia now. They are right now contesting the border, the river border between Estonia and Russia. The Estonians every year go out and put buoys in the middle of the river and demarcate for people on boats where they should be. And the Russians have been going out now and taking down those buoys and claiming that more of the river is theirs. And they're going to keep up these kinds of efforts at borderization, as they have done in Georgia as well. Not a NATO ally, but they've kept moving the fence in Georgia. Imagine if Russia were to look at, say, Narvik, which is a Russian-speaking city in Estonia, and say, that should be ours, or at least part of that. This piece of Narvik should be ours, or the whole bank of the river should be ours. And they do it, and then they stop. Our NATO allies, and I'm thinking even UK and Germany and France, are everybody ready to go to war with Russia over that piece of territory? I don't know. I worry about that. And that's the kind of scenario that is much more troubling, is a limited a limited assault on a sovereignty of a country, which NATO then has to choose: is it worth escalating to a real war with Russia over that?
But then again, if NATO was robust in its response and ejected very harshly any force that had been even taken over 10 or 50 meters or 100 meters of territory and just pushed them back, the question goes the other way. Would Russia risk escalating into a full conflict against NATO? And that's an interesting one.
It is. And under normal circumstances, I would say no way. They would not do it. They know they're in a weaker position. They read the West. They view us as weak and indecisive. But when we act decisively, they know that they don't have the ability to match that, so they stop. That's normal. We have been watching abnormal, unusual things from Putin over the past 3 to 5 years. He misjudged completely his own military strength, Ukraine's military strength, the unity and resolve of the West in supporting Ukraine. He has now weakened Russia dramatically as a result of his invasion of Ukraine, and yet he keeps going. He's doubling down and doubling down. So it is a little bit less certain now that they would back down the way they normally would. And all of our intelligence is telling us that they are actually preparing for a wider war. And that's one of the indicators, as we learned from World War I, is that when you make preparations, it becomes more possible.
So do you think NATO needs to be much more robust in its support for Ukraine and give them much more capability and much more robust in dealing with actions that Russia is doing in that sub-conflict threshold, in the grey zone, as we describe it in many areas, with what they're doing in cyber and all the other activities you talked about?
Yes, absolutely. On both counts. On the hybrid one, there should already be consultations at NATO under Article 4, which is consultations about security threats, about what Russia is doing. We should be sharing information. We should be talking about best practices on a national basis. What is each country doing? We should be exposing publicly what Russia is doing as hybrid attacks against our countries. We should be much more robust in tackling that in order to try to deter continuation of that. As for Ukraine, this is the most important and most interesting issue about this NATO summit, or where we are right now. There is a difference of view between the majority of European allies, and on the one hand, and a few European allies in the United States on the other, about how important Ukraine is to Europe's security. Most European allies view the security of Ukraine as essential to the security of Europe. If Ukraine is not safe, secure, defended, and Putin is stopped there, they believe that Russia will try to develop the means and attack Europe elsewhere, particularly those countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. So we're talking Finland, we're talking Baltic states, we're talking part of Poland, and so on. That is a very real threat, and most European allies see that, and therefore they want to support Ukraine, stop Russia's war in Ukraine, and get Ukraine into NATO so we deter future attacks. That is the best way, in my view, and I agree with those European allies, the best way to reestablish peace in Europe for the long haul. The United States under President Trump does not see it that way. They draw a bright line, and I should say not only President Trump, President Biden did this too. They draw a bright line between NATO and our obligations to defend NATO allies and those who are not in NATO, where we can provide some help or some support, but we're not going to get involved. We're not going to defend them. And they see Ukraine as on the other side of that bright line and expect Ukraine to stay on the other side of that bright line. That's been both the Biden and the Trump approach. I think that's going to lead to more war if we do that. But that is the difference in NATO right now, and why it is downplayed a little bit at the summit this week.
Are we in a situation now where effectively we are in Cold War 2.0 or maybe Cold War 3.0, but we just have a number of other different potential enemies that we're having to focus on?
Yeah, The people in Ukraine would not describe this as a Cold War. Uh, they, they would describe this in vastly different terms as a hot war with lots of killing and casualties and deliberate targeting of civilians and war crimes and all of that. Now, as far as NATO and Russia go, uh, as I said, Russia is engaging in all kinds of hybrid attacks, more than they did during the Cold War. They didn't have the means or the thought process to pull this off. They did intelligence operations, but nothing really big and military like that. This is or disruptive insider societies like they're doing now. So this is actually more than that. So a reboot and an upgrade, I guess, of the Cold War. And we also, as I said, I don't think we can emphasize this enough. Putin is different now than he was when he first took office, in the sense that he has built up an authoritarian, repressive regime where he's the sole authority. He has built up military capabilities and intelligence capabilities and disinformation capabilities and Sputnik and RT and you name it. He has built all this, and he has demonstrated an ideological drive to rebuild the Russian Empire, seeing himself as an accumulator of Russian lands like Catherine the Great. This is now a much more dangerous situation than a Soviet Union that had an expansionist ideology, but basically was contained in its borders.
So, finally, if I ask you to get your ambassadorial crystal ball out, are we going to be discussing about greater instability, about the same level of instability, or are we going to have a safer world in about 12 months' time?
I think it all depends on Vladimir Putin being in power. If Vladimir Putin remains in power, we are going to have a threat-driven world. We're going to look at the war in Ukraine. We're going to look at potential conflict elsewhere, hybrid attacks. That's what's going to happen. Once Putin leaves the scene, by whatever means that happens, and whenever that happens, I think there's a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance that a new Russian leadership will want to stop the bleeding, stop damaging their own country, and start rebuilding. And that would be a much better situation for the West as well.
Well, let's hope we get there. Mr. Ambassador Kurt, thank you very much indeed for talking to me again on Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you, Philip. It's been a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.